Okay, this is video 7. It'll be a little less lengthy than the last one, but it's still a very important one. If we are going to be responsible for reporting suspected abuse, it's very important for us to therefore have a clear idea of what sorts of indicators might tell us to be suspicious. Those indicators can be physical, emotional, and or evidence as the person's behavior, the potentially abused person's behavior. On their own, sometimes indicators may not be substantial. They might seem just normal. But when you put them into a constellation or combination and look at the totality of those indicators, they may cross the threshold and create a reason for you to be suspicious. Indicators should not be used to conclude that abuse has occurred, remember, but just to see that there is a suspicion of abuse or neglect. And again, I'll emphasize that your personal barometer of what constitutes a suspicion of abuse or neglect may not be identical to somebody else's. And again, I'll point out that the law says that you are not absolved of your responsibility to report just because somebody else hasn't reached that threshold. It's a personal decision, and it's important for you to act, even if other people aren't suspicious, if you are. So, what are some of the indicators of physical abuse? Some of them, and there are others, and there is a reading that you will have been sent, and you should understand that you should look at it and be able to answer some questions here, are indicators such as new injuries over old ones. If you think about it, if you've hurt yourself, typically you guard or protect the area where you hurt yourself, and typically you don't go right out and do the exact same type of activity unless you're a high-performance athlete, perhaps. So when children are having injuries on areas that they would normally protect, that should be a clue to us. Any sort of unusual or unexplained burns, cuts, bruises, or broken bones. For example, cigarette burns have a particular look about them. They're often the very same shape, and they often have little bits of evidence of ash in them. Unfortunately, they are fairly recognizable. People may say that they have been cut in certain ways or bruised in certain ways that don't fit with the story that they tell. So for example, if a person tells you they got a black eye by running into a flat surface, that's not impossible to do, but it's difficult to do. And broken bones. There are bones that we break fairly easily, like our wrist or our forearm, but there are other bones that we don't break as often, such as our jaw. So if we have a broken jaw and we don't have a story behind it, such as a car accident or other injuries that go along with that, then there's probably something suspicious there. Also look at unusual imprints on the skin. These may not be bruises. Sometimes you walk into a room, you see two people who look like they're acting a bit nervously, and on the arm of the child you see what looks like a handprint. Perhaps the person was slapped, or perhaps their hand was being squeezed and now the blood is gradually going back in. And I've personally been in this circumstance before where I have seen an individual pointing at the imprints on their skin, and even though the individual was not able to verbally explain what was going on, their behavior and the imprint was enough for us to act. Sometimes you'll see people demonstrating a fear of physical contact. Sometimes they do something we call guarding. So for example, they may shy away when you go to give them a hug, or if you walk past them with your hand up, they may act like they're afraid you're going to hit them. So those are examples of what we might look for. Unusually withdrawn or aggressive behavior by the victim, such as running away or absences, refusing to be in spaces with certain individuals. I mentioned earlier the example of a child that doesn't want to go home or doesn't want to be alone with somebody. And sometimes we might see what we call precocious behavior. We're going to come up with that term again later on when we talk about sexual abuse indicators. But when we start seeing children acting in a way that is unexpected for their age, that's when we're talking about something precocious. A person is doing something we wouldn't expect at that age. So if you see children being unusually aggressive and using language or physical striking out behaviors that they didn't likely come up with for themselves, that should be a clue. Now, at the end of this video, I'd like you to search the Safe Kids BC website, and you may also look up other ways of finding out about indicators. There are lots and lots of terms, so you can certainly just Google the terms indicators of abuse. And I'd like you to identify some different or more indicators in each of these categories, and be able to put them in your journal and use them in discussion. Indicators of neglect is the next section. Here, we look for things like a person who has poor hygiene. And again, we're not talking about something that happens once in a while. Children are often not very good at keeping their hygiene. So we're looking at more of a pattern of behavior. Things that perhaps their parents might necessarily be involved with. For example, dirty fingers don't concern me. But if a child has perpetually got mucus on his face and it's drying there, or a child hasn't washed his hair in a very long time, those should be clues to us. Clothing that is dirty, torn, or worn out, and still repeatedly worn. Again, kids get dirty clothing, but if they're always wearing that clothing and nobody seems to notice it, and particularly if it's soiled with body fluids, that should be a big concern to us. Clothing that's inadequate, especially for the weather. A lot of kids will forget their coats on the playground, but we're looking at things like children leaving their home in the morning without having proper clothing for rain or for cold. Insects in the clothing or on the body of the person, and we're talking about things like worms or cockroaches, but what we're not talking about, curiously, are head lice. A little sort of trivia about head lice is that head lice actually prefer clean hair, and so children can get head lice even if they are very well cared for. Head lice do not only go on people who are neglected, and so I don't use them as an indicator. They are a constant in elementary schools. Don't ever use somebody else's hat or brush. Frequent absences at school, especially if they are not well explained, and especially if children, for example, nobody's calling in, or if the child doesn't talk about them in ways that explain the absence, such as I was sick, or my family took me on a surprise trip. Inadequate food at school, not having a meal or not having something that is going to provide nutrition. Unattended medical and dental needs. Way back in the story of Elliot, I said there were things I didn't include, and one of them was that Elliot's teeth were entirely rotten, and so were those of his siblings. So the idea that he was neglected was pretty obvious. His teeth were literally, his whole mouth smelled so bad from infected teeth that he was systemically very ill. Is the person underweight or frequently ill? And it may be hard to believe, but as a child, I was always incredibly skinny, no matter how much I ate. But I wasn't neglected. I only would have had that one thing. And so nobody called the ministry on my family because I didn't have the sort of constellation or assembly of these things. Again, I want you to look up and see if you can find others and journal them and be prepared to discuss them. Indicators of sexual abuse can include things like sexually transmitted diseases or infections, or pregnancy, especially for children who we did not think were sexually active. Stained, torn, or bloody underclothing, stained with semen, stained with blood, and so forth. Bruised genitals or bruised anus, or a child who is complaining of pain in those areas. A sore throat, again, on its own, that is a very common thing. But in a constellation of these things, especially if a person reported to you that they had been forced to perform some type of sex act, that might be a concern. Pain while walking or sitting that is poorly explained. Semen stains on their clothing, or an odor that comes from body fluids that have not been cleaned. A sudden change in behavior, and some of the behaviors that you might see here are the child withdrawing from other people and anybody that might be like the person you suspect is abusing them, not just the abuser. So maybe they stay away from all older men, for example. And yes, men are far more likely to commit sexual abuse. Avoidance in general of social groups, of just staying away from people. Sexually precocious behavior. We talked about precocious behavior before, meaning behavior that is more associated with people who would be older. So when you see young children doing things that are sexual, it should be a huge flag to us. And it might strike you as odd that a child who's being sexually abused might act in a way that is sexual. But remember, children are very impressionable. So if somebody in authority in their life is telling them that sex is a good thing or sex is evidence that they're loved, that child may use that same behavior to interact with others. And I personally have observed this where a young woman was propositioning, I've seen it more than once, But in the particular case where the young woman was propositioning all of the teenage boys and even teachers around that person, and they were doing that because that was their normal. So look at their attitudes and their knowledge around sexuality. I noticed the typo there, you got an extra T as a bonus. Okay, and look again for some others. Indicators of emotional abuse. Sometimes people we talked about earlier may convert their symptoms into physical symptoms or psychosomatic complaints. People may experience trauma, emotional trauma, as physical symptoms such as headaches or nausea or diarrhea. They may wet their bed. They may have disruptions in their sleep, and these can manifest by the person telling you they didn't get enough sleep or by falling asleep in class. They may be extremely withdrawn, or they may be extremely aggressive toward other people. They may use the same sorts of behavior that may be happening towards them. So they may be verbally abusive or verbally threatening to others. They may have a higher than usual concern about failing, seem very traumatized or worried that they got a bad mark on a test or that you marked them as being late on their attendance. They may be unusually compliant and do whatever they are told to do, almost like a sergeant, sort of like a soldier responding to a sergeant, because they are so used to being given extreme consequences. They may experience really strong swings in moods that don't make sense. A very small thing happens and they have a very strong emotional response. They may demonstrate or complain of symptoms of anxiety or depression. They may run away. They may attempt to commit suicide. And again, once more, you can look up some indicators in addition to these and add them to your journal. No matter what type of abuse, we can often find that people demonstrate it in their emotions. So in the last slide, I said indicators of emotional abuse. In this slide, I'm saying emotional indicators of abuse of all kinds. This would apply in neglect, physical, sexual, or emotional abuse. So anytime that you see a pattern where there's sudden changes in behavior and or emotion, that can be part of your constellation of indicators. They can include aggressive behavior. They can include withdrawing socially or avoiding certain environments or certain activities, school absences, for example, or attempts to commit suicide, running away, or guarding or protecting a part of their body. For example, I've seen individuals who would cover up their skin even on the hottest of days, or tell you that they couldn't participate in physical education because they didn't want you to see evidence on their skin that they had been harmed. Sexual seductiveness and promiscuity. We talked about this a little bit earlier, where people may act in a way that is more sexual as a way of kind of meeting needs that come from being abused. They may exhibit behavior in terms of their eating, such as we've talked about before with eating disorders. They may use drugs as a way of escaping or self-medicating. And they may have a significant change in compliance, becoming either more compliant than most children or more defiant and getting into a lot more trouble. Very, very common. They may demonstrate anxiety about certain people, certain places, certain events, or certain times, and they may not want to talk about it. You may see delays in development, such as we saw in Elliot, who was behind in his use of the toilet and his speaking, even though he did not have a developmental diagnosis. The person may seem to have a lack of attachment to their caregiver or to any type of caregiver, and that can be very strange to see a person who just doesn't seem to be comfortable around any type of affection. And they may have a dramatic change in their self-esteem, and particularly it usually means that the self-esteem has gone down. So be aware of all of these types of indicators and think about how they work in combination. So you may see a student who's working extra hard at his homework, and that on its own is typically good news. But if the child is working extra hard in his homework and he tells you that he's deathly afraid of going home and telling his parents that he got a bad mark, and if he has bruises and guarding behavior, now I might start to see that extra diligent student in a different light. Okay, hopefully this is useful to you, and I want you to look up further other indicators.